It looks like the federal government is running some sort of sham consultations for its gun control bill C-71. And when I say sham, I mean the very people the government says they consulted are saying these consultations didn't happen with them at all. The Ministry of Public Safety is bringing in new gun control legislation here in Canada called Bill C-71. Now, Bill C-71 was brought in the wake of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Canada's usual liberal virtue signaling fashion. And Bill C-71 has been pushed as a means to curb increasing gun violence in Canada's urban city centres. The bill was introduced right after Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale's Guns and Gang Violence Summit in March. The new law resurrects the long-dead firearms registry in another form, now requiring gun retailers to keep records of sales as opposed to the federal government doing it. The new law also resurrects something else, the ATT, or the Authorization to Transport, meaning that highly vetted and screened owners of restricted firearms will now have to call up the chief firearms officer one more time and seek permission before they can transport their restricted firearm to the gun range, which is, of course, the only place we are allowed to shoot restricted firearms anyway. And the gun law will also arbitrarily prohibit the CZ858 and the Swiss Arms Green Carbine for some reason that the Liberals have never produced or revealed or even hinted at, for that matter. Best estimates say there are at least 15,000 of these lawfully owned firearms kicking around Canada. Now, it's a broad, sweeping, frankly unnecessary law that should involve rigorous debate and evidence-based policy with everybody involved. But as revealed in the Gun blog over the weekend, that could not be further from what's actually happening with this law. According to the Gun blog, who got access to this order paper question about the consultation process on Bill C-71, asked by Conservative MP Larry Miller, and I double-checked for myself, the Ministry of Public Safety lists 53 people or organizations as the total number of people the government was consulting with on C-71. And while the government's order paper response assures us all that the Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, sought the input of a broad range of groups and individuals with diverse experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives, fewer than 1/5 of the people on that list were from the pro-firearms rights side of the argument. I counted. It was 9 of 53. Instead, the government has been consulting with labor unions like Unifor and the Canadian Labour Congress and a bunch of women's groups like the YWCA. The government consulted with 2 different people with the Coalition for Gun Control. Actually, it's 3 different people, but I'll get to that in a second. And for some reason, they also consulted 2 different people at the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University on a gun control legislation? Like what? Why is the government consulting so much with Ryerson University's Diversity Institute on Canadian firearms legislation? What could the authors of such notable articles as Nasty Women, When Leadership and Gender Stereotypes Collide, possibly know about the physics of the CZ858 or the Swiss Arms Green Carbine? Why would the authors of an article called Between the Corporation and the Closet, Ethically Researching LGBTQ Identities in the Workplace, care if I have to call the chief firearms officer before I take my handgun to the range? Seems a little out of their area of expertise, wouldn't you say? Well, that would be because not only are these consultations not happening with the pro-gun lobby, but the ones that are happening with the anti-gun activists are happening with the duplicate organizations involving pretty much the exact same people. You see, those wackadoodles at Ryerson's Diversity Institute overlap strongly with the Coalition for Gun Control. Wendy Cukier, who heads up the Coalition for Gun Control and whose organization was consulted at least twice, actually it's 3 times, but again, I'll get to that in a second, is also the lead author on many documents at Ryerson's Diversity Institute. Isn't that convenient? But that's not where the overlap and astroturf of these consultations begins and ends. Oh no, friends. The Canadian Women's Foundation's Paulette Sr. was also consulted. She's also the head of the YWCA Canada. But then the Liberals also consulted with the YWCA Toronto, which is a subgroup of the group that Paulette Sr. also heads. This all seems pretty familiar and incestuous for diversity, doesn't it? But it gets even more astroturfy, and you are not going to believe this one. Two other people who are listed as being consulted by the government, but without their organizations being listed on the consultation page, have been paid government consultants who have written extensively in support of gun control in Canada. Peter Donalow is the vice chairman of Hill and Knowlton Strategies. They do a heck of a lot of work in government PR. Anyway, Donalow wrote a crazy op-ed in the Globe and Mail a few months back, and he said it's now much easier in Canada to own a gun than drive a car, which is completely insane because if you own a gun, you know that's a bunch of baloney. I'm pretty sure I don't have to call some bureaucrat in a cubicle before I take my car out for a spin on the road. Anyway, and David Rodier. He's also of Hills and Knowlton. He's a former lobbyist for the aforementioned Coalition for Gun Control, but he's also the former advisor to Alan Rock, the very liberal minister who brought in the gun registry the very first time around. The government didn't list the organization these consultants were with as an attempt to protect their sham scam consultations from any real public scrutiny. But if you thought that was the end of the sneaky, conniving BS from these liberals on C71, it is not. It is so far from not being done. When the gun blog reached out to some of the pro-firearms groups that were listed as participants of the consultations, they discovered that those gun rights groups hadn't been consulted whatsoever. Tony Bernardo of the Canadian Shooting Sports Association said he was never consulted, despite being listed as though he had been. Tracy Wilson from the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights said that she had never been contacted by the Liberals as part of their consultations on C71. The Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation's president Heath Dreger was listed as being consulted, but he said he was not contacted by the feds. And Alison Groot, the managing director of the Canadian Sporting Arms and Ammunition Association, said that her group had not been consulted. They were denied an opportunity to speak to the public safety minister's staff, and they were also denied an opportunity to speak at a House of Commons review committee on Bill C-71. From the very beginning, Bill C-71 was a solution in search of a problem. The Liberals wanted gun control, so they used increased gang violence in inner cities to bring it in, even though law-abiding Canadian licensed firearms owners are not the people committing inner city gang violence. That's crazy. Liberals needed consultations to go in their favor, so not only did they unfairly weight the consultations with pro-gun control activists, but the Liberals doubled up on many of them, and they were not transparent about the rest of them. There were only 9 of 53 people listed as consulted that represented hunters, sports shooters, and firearms retailers. And we know at least 4 of those weren't even spoken to at all. So 5 of 53. That's all the consultation that Canada's well over 2 million firearms license holders get from the Liberal government before they turn many of us into criminals overnight. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Gun control is a sacred cow of the liberal left, but so is environmentalism. And I've got a brand new book out exposing the godfather of the green scam here in Canada, David Suzuki. The book is called The Case Against David Suzuki, an Unauthorized Biography, and you can download it for free right now at suzukibook.com. And if you want to pitch in to cover the cost of producing this book for you, you can do that there too at suzukibook.com.